Number 9. Rebecca Mellon. The marriage between Rebecca Mellon and Donald Mellon Jr. came to a sudden and deadly end at their home in Phoenix in 2012. Donald was sitting on the couch talking on the phone when Rebecca approached and fired a single shot at him. She lit a cigarette as her husband lay dying. She waited 23 minutes before calling 911. Rebecca initially told police that she walked out of the bedroom and found Donald shot, but her story didn't add up, and investigators found surveillance footage and other incriminating evidence. She eventually owned up to the murder, but her attorneys argued for leniency, claiming that Donald had an extreme jealousy problem. According to Rebecca, he was abusive and controlled every aspect of her life, to the point where he wouldn't even let her have a job. Donald allegedly became even more jealous after they got married, despite his promises to change. And the reason police were able to obtain footage of the crime so easily was because the couple's house was filled with security cameras that Donald used to keep constant track of Rebecca. Regardless of her reasons for shooting Donald, the crime was premeditated, and the video helped prove it. Rebecca ultimately took a deal and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. The defense argued that the punishment was too harsh, but to Donald's loved ones, it was nowhere near enough. Number 8. Justin Barkley. Justin Barkley was 4 months into an LSD binge when he fatally shot a UPS driver named William Schumacher outside a Walmart in Ithaca, New York in 2016. He fled the scene, and an 8-hour standoff with law enforcement ensued, during which Barkley shot a gun in the air and ran over the victim's body with his vehicle. He later told investigators he had shot Donald Trump while in a paranoid and deluded state, and he also claimed that someone had been drugging him. The psychological effects of Barkley's drug abuse would be the crux of his defense attorney's argument in court, but his acid bender didn't get him off the hook. After undergoing a mental evaluation, the judge declared him competent to stand trial. He ultimately took a deal and pleaded guilty to manslaughter in exchange for a 25-year sentence, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. At his sentencing, Barkley apologized to Schumacher's family and said that he wished he had gotten the help he needed instead of spiraling out of control and taking an innocent man's life. Number 7. Timothy Crook. One morning in 2007, a paranoid schizophrenic named Timothy Crook crept into his elderly parents' bedroom in Wiltshire, England, and brutally bludgeoned, strangled, and stomped them to death. He then put the bodies of 83-year-old Robert Crook and 76-year-old Elsie in the trunk of his car and dumped their remains on a property he owned 150 miles, 241 kilometers away. When concerned friends asked Crook where the couple was, he claimed they were at his property trying to sell it for him. But his story didn't sit right with them, so they reported Robert and Elsie missing. Police soon discovered the victims' bodies in some overgrowth at Crook's property. They found Crook's car abandoned near a train station and soon uncovered footage of him catching a train to London. Crook was apprehended and charged with murder. He was initially found incompetent to stand trial, but his condition eventually improved. 8 years later, the matter finally proceeded in court. During the trial, the jury heard about Crook's complicated relationship with his parents and his lengthy mental health history. Before the murder, he had lost his job and moved back in with his parents. He was supposed to be under supervision, but had failed to register with local mental health services and refused to take medication. His condition worsened while it went unmonitored. Instead of recognizing that he had committed a crime, Crook believed that the British and American governments were conspiring against him. The court found him guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility due to his mental health, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 6 years. He was given credit for the 8 years he had already served while waiting for the case to go to trial. Number 6. Heaven Bilal. In 2021, 41-year-old Heaven Bilal moved to London to be closer to her brother, 46-year-old Omar. A few months later, a neighbor heard screams coming from inside the woman's apartment and called the police. Inside, officers found Omar's body covered partially in garbage bags. They quickly discovered that he had been stabbed and decapitated, and his head was missing. The police eventually found Omar's head in a travel bag inside a bedroom wardrobe. They also noticed that Heaven's clothing was covered in blood, and it didn't take long for them to put two and two together and arrest her on suspicion of murder. Prosecutor LaRon Jones said that there was no doubt Heaven killed Omar, but acknowledged that she was in the grips of a severe mental illness when the crime occurred. Court-appointed experts agreed and told the court that the defendant suffered from delusions to the point where she didn't understand that what she did to her brother was wrong. Jones said that it was unusual for both the prosecution and the defense to recommend that jurors find a suspect not guilty by reason of insanity, but this case was a rare exception to the norm. The jury returned a verdict as recommended, and Bilal was sentenced indefinitely to a psychiatric institution. Number 5. Dwight Jones. Renowned forensic psychiatrist Stephen Pitt was fatally gunned down at his office in Scottsdale, Arizona in 2018, marking the first of 6 murders that would occur over the next 5 days. The killing spree continued the next day with the double murder of 2 paralegals at a divorce law office. It was followed by the killing of a psychologist at his office and a couple at their home. After noticing that the victims were connected with her divorce case, Connie Jones went to the police with her suspicions that her ex-husband, 56-year-old Dwight, was the killer. Dwight and Connie had gone through a contentious divorce and custody battle nearly a decade earlier. He felt wronged by the court system and by his ex, and became so consumed with bitterness that he lost his job as a truck driver and spent years living out of hotels. A few days before the first homicide, Jones waged a social media campaign in an attempt to convince people that Connie was the real abuser in their marriage. He believed that his ex-wife had conspired with psychiatrists, lawyers, and members of the judicial system to revoke his parental rights. Police tracked Dwight's whereabouts to a local hotel where they discreetly evacuated other guests with plans to apprehend the suspect. But Jones figured out what was going on and shot at officers before retreating into his room. Luckily, nobody was hurt. Jones then took his own life, bringing his convoluted campaign for justice to an end. He never faced justice for his actions, which left a trail of needless devastation and heartbreak in their wake. Number 4. Esteban Santiago. After arriving in Fort Lauderdale, Florida from Alaska in 2017, Esteban Santiago retrieved his suitcase, took it to a nearby bathroom, and loaded a gun that he had carried in his checked luggage. He exited the restroom and opened fire on travelers in one of the airport's baggage claim areas. He killed 5 people and injured 6 more by direct gunfire. Several dozen others were injured in the chaos that ensued. In the wake of the shooting, it was revealed that Santiago had served in the military and was discharged from the National Guard in 2016 for strange behavior. During that same time period, he allegedly became increasingly solitary and violent. Later that year, he showed up at an FBI office in Anchorage, claiming that an intelligence agency was controlling his mind. He also said that he was hearing voices and that someone was following him. The troubled former soldier was sent for a mental evaluation, and his handgun was taken away. After the massacre, Santiago once again told authorities that he was under mind control and claimed that the CIA had forced him to join the terrorism group ISIS. His brother Brian told the New York Times that he noticed Esteban becoming more paranoid in the time leading up to the horrific crime, and he had encouraged his brother to get help. But he was released after spending just 4 days in the hospital, and his handgun was returned to him weeks before the shooting. Santiago was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia during the court proceedings, but his condition improved with medication, and he was found competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in federal prison without parole. Number 3. Jay Clark. 33-year-old Callan Hunter was viciously stabbed in her North London home in 2020. Her neighbor Greg Ainsworth overheard the attack, called the police, and rushed over in an attempt to help. He broke down the front door and encountered what he later described as a horror scene. Ainsworth later described seeing Hunter's partner, Jay Clark, standing over her with a knife in one hand and her hair in the other. He began dragging the victim along the floor while Ainsworth bravely shouted at him to stop and asked him what he was doing. Hunter was airlifted to a hospital where doctors miraculously managed to save her life. She had so many stab wounds to her face, back, and neck that they gave up on trying to determine the exact number after counting more than 30. While Hunter began her arduous road to recovery, authorities charged Clark with attempted murder. In the days leading up to the nearly fatal attack, Hunter had been trying to end what the court described as a toxic relationship with Clark, who had become convinced that Hunter was cheating on him. It wasn't the first time he had questioned his partner's loyalty, according to the judge overseeing the case, who described the defendant as prone to unreasonable jealousy. Clark was found guilty and received a life sentence with a minimum of 14 years. Number 2. LaRon Smith. 24-year-old LaRon Smith was heard screaming obscenities to himself outside his Pittsburgh apartment one afternoon in late 2020. Later that day, he followed his neighbor, Ernest Mills Jr., and the man's girlfriend as they were walking to get pizza. Smith fatally shot Mills, then fled the scene. A SWAT team took him into custody 2 days later on suspicion of murder. In the wake of the horrific crime, a disturbing history of the suspect's deteriorating mental health came to light. Smith's mother, Lonna Johnson, told Trib Live that in 2019 she received a phone call from airline employees in Chicago who were refusing to let Smith catch a connecting flight due to his strange behavior. They told Johnson that her son believed he was being kidnapped and taken to China. Smith returned to Pittsburgh, where he became even more isolated over the following months. He removed all his smoke detectors because he was convinced they had cameras in them and thought a woman on the TV was communicating to him. After finding bottles filled with urine in his apartment and noticing that he had stopped taking care of himself, Johnson made an appointment for her son to see a mental health specialist. But he never made it to the appointment, which was scheduled for the day after his neighbor's murder. Smith pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder. At his sentencing, his lawyer, Carmen Robinson, urged for leniency, citing the defendant's untreated paranoid schizophrenia at the time of the crime. She also pointed out that Smith lived in a dangerous neighborhood and claimed that it exacerbated his perception of the danger he was in. But the judge was quick to mention how Mills ran from Smith during the shooting and how there was no reason for Smith to perceive the victim as a danger. He sentenced the defendant to 16.5 to 43 years in prison. Because Smith pleaded guilty but mentally ill, he'll be housed at a prison that is capable of accommodating his mental health needs. Number 1. Diana Avera. An Alabama woman named Diana Avera was involuntarily committed to a mental hospital after being arrested for disorderly conduct in 1982. She exchanged several letters with her family, including one where she asked them to visit her. 3 months later, they were told that she had escaped. Nobody has seen or heard from her ever since. More than 40 years after Diana's disappearance, her sister Becky Hoover told news station WKRG that Diana had a history of thinking people were following her. After being hospitalized, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Hoover also described how her sister became zombie-like during her time at the hospital. She said that Diana was barely able to speak at times, dragged her feet when she walked, and that she was undergoing electroconvulsive shock treatments. In her letters, Diana made it clear that she wanted to get out of the hospital and back to her 2 sons. The interview came amid the family's renewed efforts to shine light on Diana's disappearance and to find out what happened to her. They don't believe that the authorities tried very hard to find her, and the missing persons report they filed back in 1982 seems to have been lost. Diana's niece, Amanda Collins, filed a new missing persons report in 2020. This time it caught the attention of Mobile County Sheriff's Detective J.T. Thornton, who admitted that the records regarding the disappearance are vague. He said that he hopes the case can be solved, but for now, Diana is still considered a missing person, and the details surrounding her case remain obscure. Thanks for watching. Would you rather have your partner cancel a surprise vacation they were planning after their recent secretive behavior led you to mistakenly accuse them of cheating, or have a neighbor who constantly thinks you're up to no good because you prefer to keep to yourself and don't want to be friends? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.